Our final topic of the West has to do with farming. And what you're looking at is an old map. What we can tell from the top of it, it says the Great American Desert. We're not too sure of where this was if we don't look closely. And there's some hints if you know geography really well. I think the biggest hint for me down here where my cursor is Santa Fe. I know today that's in New Mexico. Also, I see the Arkansas River. If we know where the Arkansas River goes, then we might have an idea. This is primarily looking at today what would be probably Kansas, Oklahoma, a little bit of Nebraska, some of Colorado, and some of New Mexico. And to back up, it's a map of part of the Great Plains, including Kansas. So following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, this is a big chunk of land we bought from Napoleon. Jefferson bought it. After we bought the Louisiana Purchase, some explorers began to go out. And one of the guys that went out was Stephen Long. And he explored this area, and he, if I recall correctly, produced this map. Anyway, the conclusion that he came to is he thought that this land was a desert. And you can see it on the map besides the giant title. He wrote on there, the Great American Desert. And back then, the general belief was any area that didn't have trees was a desert. And also, another conclusion that was drawn were deserts were thought to be unfit for farming. So if there were no trees, it was a desert. If it was a desert, you couldn't farm. This is his quote. He said, "I do not hesitate in giving the opinion that it is almost wholly unfit or not good for cultivation, farming, and of course uninhabitable by a people depending on agriculture for their subsistence." So these were the conclusions that he drew. And because of that, for a long, long time, people believed that this was the Great American Desert. However, well, before we go on to that, here's the Great Plains, okay? And it's a pretty big area. All of Kansas is included in it. It goes from the border of Mexico all the way up into Canada. Anyway, over time, people realized that this wasn't a desert. In fact, it was one of the best places in the world to farm. So it's good for farming, but there's some obstacles in the way. What do we need to get rid of before we can begin to farm? 1800s, a couple of things. The bison, which primarily white hunters will accomplish that. And also Native Americans were living here. So once those obstacles were removed, people could come out and settle and farm, but where are they going to get the land to farm from? And they actually have two options. We've learned about one, option number one, from the railroads. So you haven't seen these posters or this map, but this is we looked at a similar poster. This one is millions of acres, Iowa and Nebraska lands for sale by the Burlington, Missouri Railroad Company. This map is showing you some of the railroads that are going across the West. That wasn't the only option. Who else has a lot of land besides the railroads in the West that we can get for cheap? And the answer is the government. Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam's a famous fictional character that represents the United States. So on this one, it says Uncle Sam will give you a home. This is an article from a newspaper in Minneapolis, St. Paul, telling you about all the land in Minnesota. So the name of this act was the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was when the national government gave away 160 acres of land in the West for free. And I put in parentheses almost. So it was a big land giveaway, and it worked. People wanted land. This is the 1800s. Americans wanted land. Europeans wanted land. A lot of Europeans are going to come over for this. And in the end, the Homestead Act gave away about 10% of America's land. So a huge, huge chunk of land throughout the Great Plains. From 1860, the Homestead Act started, the first one was in either 1862 or 1863. From 1860 to 1890, we went from 2 million to 6 million farms in the United States. So that proves that this worked. The requirements. There were certain things you had to do in order to get the land. Number one, you had to be 21 years old. Number two, you had to be a citizen, or if you were an immigrant, you had to be trying to get your citizenship. You also had to pay a one-time, they called it a filing fee or a paperwork fee. you had to pay $10. So technically speaking, it was not free, although this was a great deal to get 160 acres for $10. Then you had to live on and improve the land for 5 years. So if you moved out for 2 years and tried farming and it didn't work and you left, you lost the land. You didn't own it. It would go back to the government. You couldn't also just say, well, I'm going to take that land and never move out there. You had to make an attempt to farm or ranch for 5 years. Those were the requirements. Okay, this gets into your bell ringer. Ultimately, we're answering was homesteading easy. Homesteading was the name of the people that they called. These were the people that used the Homestead Act to get farmlands to come out and farm. So they called them homesteaders. So for your bell ringer, I'm going to show you a series of pictures. There are 4 total. For each picture, I want you to write one sentence about what life was like for homesteaders on the Great Plains. So as I scroll through these, you may need to pause to do this. Be detailed and explain things well. So that is photo number 1. In particular, on this one, pay attention to the house. Number 2, I would look at the house and the people on this one. Number 3,